Morning. So, as a prelude, I want to direct your eyes to one paragraph from this text, which is a solo role-playing game designed by Sean Tomkin, who is famous for Iron Sworn and a couple of other solo role-playing games. But this is a recent one. And I'm not picking this as like a glorious example, although I mentioned the design a couple of times because I find it interesting. But I want to take this one paragraph because for me it was rather interesting crossroads in a way. So if you read this paragraph, Stonewall, which is a little bit, I know, overtly Gothic, whatever, but I think that's fine. Like I'm not here for the literary magnificence, but rather that what it entails for the game, and we'll come to that. I mean, it's short enough that maybe I read it out loud. So this great earthen visage is twisted and warped by time and the chisels of cultists, evoking a fanged monstrosity whose gaping maw represents your entry point. I see blood dripping from those wicked fangs, but I cannot say if this vision is real or prophetic. There's nothing particular weird about this text in itself, but it's more interesting when it's put in the context. This description as a whole is expected to create a whole scene of play where somebody enters the scene, then they don't just walk through it, but they face some challenges or interestingness of some kind, or both challenges and interesting elements. But they only have this to work with. And I was actually watching some person in YouTube struggle with this. Well, struggle is the wrong word. Like to maybe unfold is a good word for it. Unfold with some struggle. But I find it interesting. So you take this that could be a paragraph in fiction, but this is supposed to give you a whole scene of play. How does it happen? Now, the way it in this game is supposed to happen is that you have this, let's say, instruments. You have an instrument, let's scroll up and go through these core solo tools. One of the key tools being this, which is called fortune chart. But what it essentially is like if you turn this to yes or no question. So, for example, this is your only entrance or into the place, which was said in the text. You might ask if there anyone guarding the entrance. It's up to you what you ask. But then the fortune chart, which is extremely simple, lets you throw a d6 normal dice, and then the yes or no question would give you by the dice roll extreme no, no, yes, extreme yes. So if you were to ask, is there someone guarding this entrance, you might get a no, or you might get a yes. But that's like the first unfolding. Like now you don't know who is guarding it. If you get a no, it's still an unfolding, but kind of leaving you even with less. But then the second tool is this also extremely simple, because this whole game was kind of made as an add-on, an afterthought. But I kind of find this simplicity in itself interesting. This inspiration table, which guides you to throw 3 d20s, so 20-sided dice. And with that, you get an action, an attribute, and a thing. So let's say you threw a 3 and let's say 15 and let's say 17. So that would mean craft and moving and resource. And this piece now, craft, moving, resource, is this sort of mystery. Like you might actually, before drawing the inspiration, you might ask a question towards this. So your question might be, for example, what is the entrance guarded by? And then you get craft, moving, resource, which doesn't quite seem fit. Maybe it would be better, it would be find or guard, but nevertheless, that's what you got. But then your challenge is like, how is this craft, moving, resource? And somebody might come from there that, okay, it's actually that there are in the entrance there are some people who are moving out stuff that seems to relate to mining, craft, and moving like old stone, but also like maybe some minerals or whatever, some resource, out of the gate itself, and it's populated by this sort of people coming in and out. And now this structure is added to, sorry for all the scrolling, but I have to do that. Added to what you had in the text. But you're still kind of unfolding. Like, there is no, what am I about to do? One thing I should say, that you would enter the scene with a role, yes. So you would be some kind of a character, and you might have some skills, so you're not on so empty on this side, but it's still like this challenge in itself is quite existent even with that character present. But so you would probably, oh, that's sorry, I have to locate in the screen. How do I let people in? It's in participants. Yes, all right. So you have something that can be thought of as partial unfolding, that you have like one thing added here, which is these people moving. You don't even know what kind of people moving some resources out of this entrance. But you might move with another question, like you could go towards the direction of, are the people in a constant stream of people, or are there empty spaces? And like maybe you get, or the question might be, are there empty, are there times when the entrance is empty? And then if you get a yes, then you might have like that you want to sneak in, and so on and so forth, whatever the direction would be. But there's no set way of playing it. But like, I wanted to stop here mostly to open this question of, what is this? Like, what is happening here? Like, this is just text. What is the style of play? One question, but also what is the style of interpretation that takes something that could be in a book, and then turns it into play, and then also treats whatever it source as much more generative than kind of word set in stone that this is what it is. Like if you're reading a traditional book, the idea is, okay, this is the text you're reading. Here it's like, no, this is just a carrot, but now you have to come up with all the other ingredients to make the food. It's I think an interesting in its extremeness of just giving you one source. But maybe I'll stop here and ask either questions or comments from you. I promise that this will be a lead-in, but and will inform the game structure in the future. But yeah, any comments, questions?
I don't know if this is the direction you're going, but what I like about this is how these questions are both an engagement with the system and also creating the system in the process of asking, right? When you encounter like one of these moments that open up, and through your question you guide the development, but also chain in the next answer.
Yes.
It's very generative. I really like it.
Yeah, and it's also like one can immediately kind of stop and say, well, here it's text, but nothing forces this to be text, like in this structure. It could be an image, or it could be a real life situation. It could be somebody doing something in the place of what's this, a paragraph of the stone wall. And you could still build a game around it. It might not be the same. It kind of could be like questions, whatever. You might make it differently, but the same principles could apply, that whatever happens is more like the carrot and the dinner is far off, but it is to be generated. And yes, you're right that this generation of the system itself is part of what I'm thinking as well. Any other comments, questions? What if I said that you have to generate a comment or a question?
The question will it be real or prophetic? We don't know.
Will the question be real or prophetic, or which will be real or prophetic?
Will the comment that we have to generate will be real or prophetic, or real or fictional?
Let me throw a dice. Cut it between a little bit more real, but slightly prophetic.
What dice type did you use?
I used D6 to stay in the harmony with the quality. Like 1 would have been real only. We got 2, which is kind of more on the real side, but 6 would have been prophetic.
So performative.
Potentially.
I really like the mood of slightly prophetic.
Yes.
Yeah, pretty good.
Do you want inspiration for your comment? I think I have at least 1 D20. I mean, not that we have to use it, but this is sort of maybe interesting. So, and also, like in this play style, if you don't find any use for material you throw in, like inspiration, you don't have to use it. So what you get is...
Wait.
Okay, I'll wait.
Don't inspire me.
I won't.
Thank you. I was just thinking that, like, this idea of throwing stuff in one's own way, right? That's a bit, if I capture what what you've been talking about well, then like this is a not like a solo RPG, and so everything that's kind of going on here is kind of to help generate, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I came across similar ideas, and I mean, not that this is like something never seen before in my life, but in now a writing context, and I think that kind of ways of how to throw things in one's own way are really a nice like domain to explore. I mean, these I had to miss maybe a bit of the detail of what you spoke about because he's like kids running around, and I need to kind of be a father at the same time, which I'm not, but which I am, but you know what I mean. But like so, like the what I'm catching is like that these things are there to help you generate, and there is a certain like version, like or like different tables, different charts, and you can kind of trigger it or make use of them by using a question, and so like if I got that well in that to that extent,
Yes.
right, then I think, I mean, this like how to throw things in your own way is its own construction site, right? So now there's a couple of possibilities how to do that laid out here, but then one could also really make a whole discipline basically, like or like a domain of research, like how to stick sticks in your spokes.
Yeah, domain of research, domain of experiment.
Exactly.
Like I mean both. Like I agree with you.
Yeah, I don't insist on the term research at all, but it's true if you say experimentation. But just kind of because it's like to me, if I would think about that, then like using a die would be, you know, it's kind of almost a symbol, like an emblem of how to use chance. But like, for example, recently I was confronted with a question that I found really strange. Was like, it was about how to find strangers. I'm like, how is that so difficult? I mean, you just walk out of the door and most of the people you see will be strangers. So like, that's an easy way to construct a stranger into a thing. But like, one could make a whole, kind of a whole work just of kind of how to stick spoke. I said it now already. But...
Yeah. A couple of things. Like generally in agreement, the one thing I wanted to also highlight. Let's put it that way. Is that okay? Here it's dice, like you said, and yes, it's an emblem of randomization or stochastics, if you want to be nitpicky about it. But we can imagine a situation where it's not dice, but it's other people. That it's whatever somebody else throws becomes your material / obstacle, which kind of what this is. Like the earlier, what was it like? Moving resource, craft moving resource. That was both material and an obstacle because it wasn't immediately clear what is it. But it kind of has to be turned from an obstacle to material. But okay, here it was generated by dice, but it could be somebody else saying or doing something for you, and they could do it freely, but you could have game rules, roughly speaking, for how they generate things, but then they become your points of generation as well. So this is also why I find this interesting, is like, okay, what's happening here, and this culture is of course focused on this, but is actually much more wider. And while this is about what you could call verbal playing or language-based generation of spaces and worlds, it's not only limited to that. And kind of like the basic functionality, if you look beyond the dice, if you look beyond the description, and you think that the description could be something else, and you think that the dice could be something else because they could create different kind of play situations. But what I find here interesting, sorry for scrolling again. I'll go back to the morbid description in all its slight banality, but I find interesting that there is radically different relation towards like what would be normally you get a book and then you read it. And that the radicality of this relation is underappreciated and maybe under considered in culture. Like it's, yes, you interpret it, but you interpret it in a radically different manner. It's actually like, this is the difference between the ready meal versus the carrot. And also the meal that you're supposed to eat, and certainly not throw spices in, because if you're reading a book, you're usually not writing your own words in the mix. But here, it's the same medium, but now it's behaving like a carrot, and you're looking at a carrot, and then there's some other stuff in your fridge, and then you have a system. Maybe the system is the fridge in this metaphor, and you start pulling stuff, and it's like, how do I combine a carrot and I don't know, a celery? It's a very different situation, even though it's the same medium, and that is for me interesting.
Can I add? I mean, this reminds me. Tell me if maybe I might be wrong, but it seems to me a little bit the book that we looked at a month ago with the creature, where you had to choose the features. And one thing I like about these both processes is that so let's say for the creature, or like, you say, okay, I need to design a character. And rather than you coming up with your own character by, of course, researching or whatever, you sort of relinquish your subjectivity or whatever to a chance aspect of the dice. So it becomes sort of like a chance game, because you then, of course, you construct meanings based on whatever the dice comes up with. So thinking about the metaphor of food, it's like, yes, you have a carrot, but then you don't really know what else you have in the bag. And you have to come up with a meal without knowing the ingredients necessarily. Like, you will find ingredients just when you pull them out from the bag. So there is an aspect of losing control, relinquishing control over whatever the dice say, that is fascinating to me.
Yeah, this is true. The one thing I would say here is like, first of all, the randomness, and why I call it stochastics, is because it's not completely random. I mean, this is known in game designer circles, that there is the saying of random lists are setting, or something to that effect, which is means that, I'm scrolling again. So when somebody writes a list like this, they are not doing something neutral, but they are putting words that have a certain color. So it's not like random in the sense of anything could happen, but it's precisely put like, I mean, there is the word, this is fantasy, so you have words like ancient and arcane, and you're therefore likely to get something that is, even though it's a surprise what you get, it comes from a certain pool, and that pool is design, and it's a key part of design itself. So in this sense, it's more surprise than random. And this opens up another point of view, which I was referring to earlier, that it could be something else than dice. It could be other people. Because also, I mean, other people offer a lot of things to our life, but one of the things that they offer is surprise. Is that it's one of the key interests that whatever they say back or do back to us is not what we exactly expected. If it would be, it wouldn't be interesting to interact with other people if we would know what they do. So in a way, dice is almost like simulating that, but it's not like, this is underlining that it doesn't have to be dice. It just it's that here because that's the focus of this culture, but like one can rethink it, how the surprise could come from somewhere else than dice. And this is in no way against your comment, but just to underline that as kind of like how there is a wider game design space and play space in this vicinity that we're in.
But also the quality of the surprise is interesting because the surprise is not like entirely free. It's like within the realm of possibilities that is given by the set of ingredients that are there on the list or in the bag or whatever. So it's like an interesting relation between of relinquishing this control, being confronted with this moment of surprise, which is not entirely random. And then moving on again from that point, or like then you get this input, and then it's like a new starting point. Now you have control or agency again to act with this ingredient or whatever you get.
Yeah, and that forms the kind of back and forth, or simulates almost the back and forth, because there's only one person playing it. So solo here means that there's only one person playing the game. So they're kind of simulating the back and forth. But the back and forth is, of course, a character of games in general. Like to use the age-old example of chess, like the back and forth is two players. But the back and forth is also a feature of, say, a conversation. And really, any human interaction, if you expand that, the back and forth doesn't have to be between two people. It could be N people, X people. So really, it's a sort of like, it needs a back and forth. So here it simulates the creation of it. Like it generates this thing and then it throws the ball back to you. And then you do something like you ask a question, which is your way of throwing the ball on the other side. And then the system here creates the way to throw the ball back to you again. And therefore you have a back and forth. Which is kind of a key here, but also a thing that could be created in many other ways, and human life is created in many ways. Yes, designing in dialogue. But okay, that's the prelude. Maybe like just to finish out, like unless there are any other comments, I could wrap this. I think a useful prelude, but we shall see if I'm beyond my if my judgment is right or wrong. Also, questions of whatever happens elsewhere in the game. I mean, in a way, like what I described is the core of the gameplay. Like 90% or more of the game is like this. Like really, that's what the system is providing. The one thing I might point out that sometimes it even gives you less. Like some place might be unknown, and then for that it has this way of generating places where you get no, not that page. Where is it? Then it's after that. Oh, it was this long. So yeah, okay. So then you get like different details. Like you might get a place which is now neutral and empty, but then you might get abandoned supplies, or it might be in the thematic of, say, a forgotten library. That's your first row, and then you might get abandoned supplies and ghostly apparition and let's put like mechanical whirring, and then that's what you're actually playing. Like you get even less in that sense, but it still following the same pattern. But okay, so, but like I said, that was the prelude, and I could now move to another screen, and which is somewhat empty, but it has some introduction, some spoken introduction towards it. There are two moves though, and there is a role called role. Can be renamed, but it's called role because it's a default. And it has a couple of moves, which have some choices. There could be more moves, but the whole point is that this is not finished, but it's a starting point. But to introduce this, now imagine this, that we started to create an organization in quotation. And we might start it by, say, somebody acting like a game master and maybe creating a situation in itself, like imaginary fictional place. Let's, for the sake of an example, call it XORG archive. And then maybe they describe that there are wonky charts on the wall, etc. I mean, that's not needed, but maybe they put that there. Maybe that's material, that's inspiration. And then there are some folios which have like titles like oxel and gem and card and so on and so forth. And but they could also say like that towards this room, which is now imaginary, but you're in, you might start from this role, but then you get the right of creating your own role into it. Like you can take these two moves, but the first one is generate, and that allows to generate a role or a move or a scene. So you could generate the whole role for yourself, which then is whatever could be like a way of acting in that imaginary room. But there is another move, which is called project. And by the way, I was still looking what's maybe the word should be projecting, but the idea is like project as in projection, not as project as in we have this project. That is like when this kind of room / space, maybe space is a better word, is created, you also get the right to project it to a physical space or a digital space or a semiotic space. There could be others, but like what that practically means that if we create that space, that's a way of creating obstacles / ingredients, but then you could take it into a real place and say, now this is this room. And of course, in a way, that room then would probably become some kind of weird mixture of fiction and reality, because like maybe there were some things that you couldn't replicate in the physical reality, but I wouldn't even sweat about it. The point is not to try to authentically replicate what is this imaginary room, but it's the point is more like utilize some capabilities of playing it in real life in itself. And of course, projecting it in digital space might be putting it in this platform, or semiotic space might, well, playing it like role play style would be putting it in semiotic space in itself. So like to utilize this similar emptiness to generate things that could be in this play, yes, but also potentially organization. And why it's potentially an organization is like, let's say you create this in like the document here, and I should now put the link to this because you should have a access to this. And for that, I have to try to move this zoom. Uh, the link, and then I'll post it in the chat. Now you should all have an access to this, because this can be used as a game board. So yeah, let's say you had this space, and then you gave somebody else the right, like I just gave you. In a way, it's already a kind of organizational move. What if you invited, like you made a physical projection of that thing that is probably mutated by the play somewhere, and then you invited somebody else? It is very, very similar, ultimately, than inviting somebody to an organization itself. Like, so I think there is an overlap here, is that we can move from even this kind of play that starts from very little, create some things, and constantly is capable of utilizing pure fiction to pure reality to everything in between, to use those then to find interesting things and highlight them and push them further, the interesting things that it finds. And then beyond that, invite real people to them. And whatever is created, whether it's text, whether it's a move, or whether it's an image, whatever it is, and by giving them rights, like just inviting them to it is a right, we are already kind of like moving towards organization itself. Now, as an introduction, like, or kind of end of the prelude, does that idea make sense?
I think it does. Would be nice to have some testing, yeah, some game testing for it. But yeah, I think it does.
That's kind of the idea. The next, this is why this is the end of the prelude. And I put some material here. We could have had more, but there is some. I also put as a potentially interesting playtest to use these maps as potentially imaginary rooms for oxel/organization yet to be defined what it is about, but it certainly should be about our shared interests, like what is interesting to play with. So now you get, first of all, of course, these two moves, which allows you to generate a role being any kind of description of a approach that you could take, like a filter to yourself, and a move, which is, in its simplicity, it's a right, like you could create a new move. And a scene here is a general term for any kind of framing. Like, it could be seen that I say, let's take this as a room or a space for organization. What do these lily pot, what are they called? Lily leaves? Let's just call them leaves for now. What are these leaves in this organization? Like, and that could be my move to use that. So this could be then a seed to play. The projection part is probably something that comes practically into play later, but we'll see about that. But yeah, the general question is, can we start from this little and come to something that is playable together, and that can that be extended, at least seen as extended, to something that invites people in? Not that it has to, it just, if it can do that, and then in that sense organizes itself. But of course, since you have the move of generate, you have the edit rights, you have the move of adding material to this bunch of pages, which includes adding a new page by just going one page forward, adds an empty page. I would first ask you, where would you like to start? Which can be something here or some other material you want to bring. I have in my back pocket as kind of a start, but I would like that it wouldn't come so much from me because I'm talking too much and controlling too much already. Somebody's drawing on this central.
Just checking out. It's nice around here. Very lively.
I mean, we can also make it larger. um, um,
You just made me smaller, actually. I feel so tiny now.
yes, this is the capabilities, and especially these hybrids of digital, but also space. But think about this, like if like taking all the capabilities what we talked about and going back to the beginning, to the prelude, like if I were to say, what if this was an organizational space you find yourself in, and ask like, so what is the I mean, I could say a role, but maybe that's too technical, but I could say like, what is the identity of this fountain, and what are the reasons you gather around it? And this is an ingredient obstacle, just like the prelude game earlier.
You gather. Should I answer? I have
Yeah,
an
yeah,
answer.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You gather around this fountain to wash your feet to gain some special ability. That's a slot for someone else to fill in.
Yes, and I will write this down, not because I will write everything down, but just to push that element. Gather around this fountain. All right. Any other, what would you add to this? And now think of this sort of spectrum, like, yes, you're kind of playing fictional game, but like at the same time, you might think like there could be like the move of projection. even here, probably wouldn't be useful but just to kind of concretize it. Like there could be a moment that there is a real fountain or a pool or a lake, which you project to be the fountain because it has water, because it doesn't have to be a fountain. And you, as people, go and wash your feet to gain a special ability, which you might at that point know what it is. But you go physically to do that. So that bridge exists. So I'm highlighting that bridge. So even here, even from this minimal thing, one can project towards a real situation. And then that real situation is a possibility to invite people who gather every month to go to a pool or a lake. I'm not saying this is the best idea. I'm just saying this kind of bridging between possibility, between seeds, between material is possible. Anybody? You don't have to connect it to this, but you can add something else as well. But it's, of course, useful to connect things because then they tend to build up. I mean, beginnings are always hard, but if you throw something in, it will form itself into something interesting. It's a little bit like play, like nothing will look good when you make the first move, but things will look interesting after multiple moves.
Come on, join us around the fountain. Let your feet in.
Yes.
Water is lukewarm. It's great.
Yeah, actually, I will create a role.
Mm-hmm.
I create a role of a person with only one foot, sitting in a wheelchair.
I would say then the effect is stronger because it's not diluted in 2 feet.
So with one foot. All right, let's add it in. Okay, I'll add one in. So I add this in a form of move, I guess. Yes. When the feet are washed or submerged in the water, there is a particular thing that people think in silence. Beside the pool, there is a stone. Maybe here it's actually the ring around the fountain itself. And once you have something on your thought, on the thought itself, you step onto the ring of the fountain. In real life, this might be like it's a lake, and then people step on a rocky surface. And each time you like have some idea about the thought you have, you move on the stone, and as long as you leave footprints from the wet feet. You continue until you don't leave any footprint. Your feet are dry. And at that point, you speak. You tell others of what you developed. And I know I'm introducing an obstacle to the wheelchair person. I kind of intentionally did that then it becomes another addition of how to include them. Maybe it becomes a way of helping them, or maybe they use the wheels, who knows? But we can come up with that. But so now it's a sort of a ritualistic pattern. And I probably added too many elements to it, but who cares? Like, I mean, and you don't have to include this, what I added or anybody else's. You might kind of think something beside that, but don't wait for me to write this, because like I said, I added too many things. Just keep on thinking / expressing moves.
So I am drawn, since I started this picture, seeing this picture, to that top right square, which looks also like a pool, but some sort of hellish pool, because of this face of this. So that's the hellish pool. So to continue from Pecco, so if your idea, one wants to contemplate in the thing, if your idea is a toxic one, once you start walking on the pathway, you don't leave any mark. Like, you don't leave your own footstep as it should be. So that's a sign that your idea is toxic or unhealthy or stolen, or not stolen, just a toxic idea, a bad thought. And so you end up in the hellish pool. And everyone will know that your idea is as such because you didn't leave any footmark, any footprint as you came off the fountain.
That's interesting. Also, I encourage you or anyone else to write them down, because otherwise I will struggle.
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
Yeah, but and as an element, like thinking of this as a projection, because nothing beholds us to this environment. Like, this also makes me think about different surfaces for this sort of ritual, like this, in a way, toxic surface could be like, I don't know, gravel in the case of a real environment, or somebody steps on the grass, and that might be that opens up this choice of actually taking the ideas into different surfaces for different reasons. The reasons yet to be defined, but nevertheless. Anybody else? You could also start from a different space. You could even take the sort of a role of a game master and decide that you kind of take over the space, which is kind of creating the scene or generating the scene. Like you could introduce, say, well, anything here, like the tree or the bush or something from the other images. Maybe I'll give an example of that style because it might be too hard to jump into that. Let's say I'll pick, let me see if I can move this. Oh, okay, let's make this very small for now. Let's make this slightly larger and put it here. So this one. I introduced this scene as a place of, let's say, a rather unusual organization in quotation marks, which has developed a kind of a, roughly speaking, symbiosis of idea or any kind of progress development. And how it works is that, for example, they might have a house plant. Like in this case, they have a place with leaves in the water, but it could also work with the house plant itself. And let's say the house plant has 5 leaves. So they take up then an idea and break up into 5 parts and make every leaf as a representative of that idea. And then they keep on keeping this house plant, or a place in a forest could also be not in their house, but in real world environment of a forest, or whatever the place is. And for example, if a new leaf grows, they must introduce a new element. Like now there are 6 leaves, so they break up and add a 6th element. And they can also use the size of the leaves, like a leaf being smaller might be a young thing or a smaller thing. And if a leaf dies, then that idea must be, or should be somehow put away or withered in some manner. And this is part of their process. And I don't know how to write that down, but this is an introduction to a scene. It's partly that image, it's partly practice. It it could be played even like zooming in and thinking that will play in this scene. And that is the place that they have, but we don't have to. It's merely kind of material. It's obstacle ingredient, just like the text can be, and the image here can be. So that was one scene introduced. And it's a scene that somebody can dive into and add on to, or leave aside and go to another scene, like the scene that we were in, like with the pool. Maybe for now, I'll just add the shortest description for this to at least have a memento of it. But I think you'll remember the idea nevertheless.
Started to build some bridges here.
I mean, this is cool already. Like now, what do your moves mean is interesting. It's like I could now see from here is that in this ideas with plants, which is a title for what was just described, like in this scene where Leo is adding bridges, there's also technique of bridges or a real situation where all of these leaves are standing for something and somebody's building bridges on it, which one could dive into.
Yeah, like the lily pads are nodes, and then we are building paths towards going from one concept to another or something. And every time that we are, while like we could lay out a field of different topics and try to literally just connect the dots. And as we do, we build a path, and the goal is to get to some other side.
Yes. And I can also see like here, like whenever, let's say they visit this place and a new lily pad has grown, that opens up this search for what is the new thing that we have to add to the nodes? What is the new node?
Yeah.
To use a too religious example, but how death of Dalai Lama instigates this search for a new one. I mean, not that it has to be that dramatic that you go from village to village, but people then discuss that what is the thing we must add? And then, of course, this bridge building being another. And now that you or somebody else added different kinds of bridges, that could be a thing to develop as well.
Yeah, like the quality of how we, yeah, I think this also gets back to like the whole squiggly line thing we were talking about, right? Like what kind of path are we making as we traverse the discourse?
Yeah, and also, do say.
Yeah, I was just thinking like part of the challenge is also, if the goal is to get to the other side, part of the challenge is like what ideas are next to one another, and can they be like, are they very difficult bridges to cross, right? Or, you know, is it very easy to go from one to the other, you know?
And here, once again, to highlight, let's imagine a situation that this idea develops, it could. And let's say Leo says, I will organize a session which has, I mean, maybe this picture may be something completely different, but take some of the ideas. And let's imagine that the new person is invited to that session. What separates that from an quote unquote organization? Of course, we don't have to think about it as such, but we can. And of course, if it would say meet weekly, then it would be already kind of organizatory. Not that it has to, but it can. And it's not a stretch. It's just a natural continuum of it. If it made itself an identity, like it's actually, I don't know, a secret cabal, maybe not go so conspiratory, like maybe a cabal of lily pads, okay, and the cabal of lily pads could have a logo that is maybe simplified from those lily pads, like taking this image and just putting a filter that it has just those pads from here as an image. What if it made a website? Then somebody might want to join it. Once again, like in a way, easy continuums, of course, continuums that take some process, etc. But nothing prevents this. So it has a very natural pathway of developing into something that behaves and really is an organization in itself. So in a way, like this pool of play, which could go a million directions and can very likely move from, now we're playing with lily pads, breaking ideas, and now we're using this image to play here on a fountain, but then like really could be anything else, can always grow into organizational directions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hold on.
Mhm.
Oh, there's.
The lily pads like that remind me of those, you know, those game, like sort of stupid game like Takeshi's Castle, where like people jump from one to the other, and if it's the correct path, then you stay on, but if it's the wrong one, then the lily pads just go down. So it could almost be like a deadly game of eventually someone will find the right path, but that means that all the previous one before have died.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like if you go down, depending on how the lily pads are arranged, you could go down one path too much and like you can't come back, right? Or maybe there's like a limit. Once you step on a lily pad, there's like a limited ability to move on that thing, right? So it might sink eventually with too many people crossing it, or I don't know.
Yes, exactly. Now you're making the rules, which also could become organizational rules. Like, think of this. Like, there is this, whatever, it's a website mirror board. And that's kind of like, let's say, a page of the organization. And then in there, every member, player, whatever, has the possibility of putting their own placement or their role in the organization or themselves into a particular lily pad or add roots. It could be that they die. That's actually an interesting and completely possible way to play an organization in this sort of cutthroat nature of traditional games, because what dies is your role. But maybe in that organization, you can always spawn new role for yourself. And that's an interesting organization. And it's, I mean, not that we have to pursue that, but that's already pointing out that what is an organization that everybody who becomes quote unquote a member has the right to spawn a new role. Then the organization, one of its processes, maybe not the only one, but now the core process is this moving between lily pads. And if you stay too long or you go to wrong path, you die, but then you can spawn a new one. But then those paths are named, and those become maybe pathways of somebody finding, like, I jumped to this pad and thought of this, then I jumped to that pad and thought of this, and then I jumped to this pad and thought of this, and now I want you to take you through that. And that's how the organization processes things. Not the only way, but one way.
I honestly think it's pretty interesting as a thing. I like that it like encourages us to map out possible conversations that we could have.
And process.
And then also it allows us to adjust the challenge as to how we're feeling about like how meta do we want to go? Like, or how big of the jumps do we want to make are, and just play as we feel. I don't know, it's an interesting way of modulating and laying out the terrain of our potential discourse.
Mhm. You're talking about the lily pads themselves.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Here, I would like to highlight that we came to that not in a way of like finding the best model and then going to the next best model, but really kind of playfully starting from lily pads. And there is an interesting method. And I would vouch that if we would have started from something completely different, I would have slapped a dungeon map here or whatever. We would have come up with something completely different, not necessarily interesting, because not that they always are, but probably unconventional. Because the funny thing is, I thought about organizations for too many hours, and I never thought of the idea of having a role where you can die, because it doesn't make sense. It's kind of boring. But now that Linda brought it from the angle here, it actually was super interesting, because it doesn't mean I die. It's like video game where like that encourages me to take paths, because I can always spawn a new role. And maybe I'm actually I have like 2 lives. So I'm in 2 different places on the lily pads, and one of them dies.
It's kind of, I mean, it's kind of like Crossy Road in a way, but for concepts. And like, what if this was like an infinite scroll, like an infinite game, right? Like kind of like the Crossy Road.
Yeah. And what if somebody then, once this would detail itself a bit more, would put this in a real space, like in a park or in a forest, and then invite people in, and
Oh
that
yeah, let's jump on. Let's actually,
Mhm.
yeah. That'd be fun.
Yeah, not that they have to, but they can. That's the whole point. Like, this opens this can space. Well, it does 2 things. It opens this wide can space where you can always move from I'm playing a game, even to the level of kind of role-playing game where I'm just describing, it's just fiction, and I'm just describing the universe, to we are actually really here, and we actually will physically go somewhere and utilize the structure, and anything in between. But then it opens it in a manner that can be as light as one wants it, because like describing something or starting from an image and adding to it is super light, and you can really quickly move to different things, or turn to be heavy, or like people needing to move to some place and doing some things, etc. So in this sense, it's like, this is kind of why I call it a generation game, because it is really kind of a generator in its approaches and moves. And it's certainly, it's like super drafty, but I think there is something there underneath.
Yeah, this is great. I'm also thinking of situations where we might be discussing something and we would be like, hey, let's just, I don't know, lily pad this conversation to figure out what to do.
Mhm.
And use it as a strategy to discuss a specific thing, for example.
Mhm. But
Yeah,
do say.
like even for like yeah, things like if there's like a vocabulary or a set of like ideas that we lay out or something, like I'm thinking of stuff from the XORG directory or like the exoglossary or things like that. and just laying out the terrain and seeing like what we come up with. Like it feels so generative as a way of approaching conversation.
It
And
would
there,
be fun to,
do,
sorry.
do
It would
say.
be fun to do what Pablo suggested, almost like, let's lily pad this conversation or this topic. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine in practicality almost how would that look like. Okay, so you map all these paths with all the possible consideration, right? And then you rest on one, see if it's stable enough, if it might the lily pad might just get you and sink, or it might be that it's just like a sort of like a step to go somewhere else, and that's how you build the connection. I mean, lily padding a conversation will be so fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that opens up like immediately, like you have this move of, like you said, like you go to the lily pad and maybe you decide whether it sinks or not. Like I took this idea that is on this lily pad and I'm standing on the lily pad, and you decide whether it sinks or not. But that becomes then the lily padding. Like it could be, of course, physical, but it could be also game mechanical. Like that, like I stand on this idea and I think it's sinking. Uh, and that becomes a different interaction in itself.
Yeah, and then where do we respawn, right, is the next question.
I mean, that's a good question. Like this is the game. Like this is also just to highlight. This is like pointing out the gaminess. Like you're now in a game design question. Maybe there is interest of setting like the starting point is always the same, and you have to move from lily pad to lily pad, and then that becomes a mechanic that always certain things come first, if that's interesting. Or it could be random, and then it's a different kind of behavior that comes from the lily pads, or it's something else. But
we
just to
collectively progress, and we decide at one point to move the spawn point somewhere else, so that like we kind of all have this safety mechanism, right? So kind of like checkpoints in our conversation where we can respawn.
or we copy this image, call the first one a level, save it, make a new version of this, or pick another image and have another pad map to ourselves, which has different concepts. Or and like just to point out this possibilities, how this sort of things that are normal for games come to be present here, but they still have this bridges towards what is traditionally considered as organization. When I was thinking about this today, like it came to me how this even kind of connects and bridges to gem like elements. Like, I mean, now we started from maps, but nothing really forces that. We could have started from, an image, like any kind of, like, of course, something else and then image as well, but we could have started from normal image, and it could have still worked. Like it could have produced something else, or would have produced something else than the lily pads, but it would be a way to like take an interesting image and build an organization out of it if we want to go that way, but it would have the bridges to build that. I also like that, like there is a role. Maybe I'll add this because that's as simple to add, and then it's remember, easy to remember. Let's put function role. Let's call it bridge maker, and that role is creates new types of bridges, and mostly kind of considering what happens when you're crossing the bridge, or how do you cross the bridge. and they can introduce new bridges, which then changes the game. Again, not that you have to include it, but just to point that out.
I like the bridge maker, because thinking again about the lily padding a dialogue, like the role of the bridge maker then becomes essential. Like, it's all about the capacity of the bridge maker to negotiate, to persuade. It's like how strong of a bridge maker you are to bring people on your lily pad, or to, you know, get people to get off your lily pad. And, you know, then it's a lot about the, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, how can, like, to what extent do several bridges start to converge on the same lily pad, and then like we decide to explore from there together, right?
Yeah. But also, like, this allows one to think, like, I mean, there could be something else on the lily pads than ideas, but just to use that as an example. But now the bridge maker could be saying, like, oh, there are these ways of moving between ideas. One of them is hopping, which is like essentially no bridge, but it's a jump, like, but it functions like a bridge. And then there's walking, and then there can be others, like, just as an example. And then that creates this process where you suddenly have the space of thinking different transitions, but using, you know, physical figures, like there's like what is jumping, what is walking in this case, what is like a stone bridge, like, which could also be one, which means that maybe it's more permanent, like
Or
this,
swimming.
or swimming. That's another, like the figural space is opening up. Now you can think like actually,
waiting for the lily to grow big enough to touch the next one.
oh, these are good
Ooh.
ones. To add this, like,
That's a long-term game.
Stone.
But if you wait too much, maybe it dies.
Yes. Swim.
Yeah.
And, wait for grow.
That's very alien.
Yeah, but I think one of the key things here, and I've been testing around this lately. I have some other stuff which I'll leave for later, from later session, is like whenever you can tap into what could be roughly called the figural, that you can pull from your rich variety of experience in the world and tap them into something abstract, it really quickly opens up these possibilities. Like suddenly, okay, it's kind of metaphoric, but it becomes more functional metaphoric. Like suddenly, like if we had these ideas and we think of what is swimming between, or what is waiting for growth between, or what is hopping between, you can quickly go through a wide or generate a wide variety of possibilities, because you are utilizing a kind of an archive that you already have, but you're filtering it, you're converting it to another use. So it becomes easier to create a variety.
What if you moved the lily pad itself?
Ah, see, you're using the figural, you're using exactly this variety, like the richness of the physical becoming a source, like okay, you like, because what we're really thinking is relation between ideas, but now we're tapping into all the physical moments. Like, actually, my relation to that idea is that idea has to move, or actually, my relation to that idea is that they are not connected, but I can hop between them, or I can swim, which is like crossing a different medium.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
The lily pad do move in nature, they do move, but as much as idea move, really. you know, by influence and proximity to other ideas, then your positionality does change naturally. Like only stupid don't change in positionality, you know. So I feel like the lily pad is such a good image. Scene.
It's amazing. Also, like they move, but they are also rooted, right? So they only move. There's like a limited amount of movement they can have before you basically kill it.
Or until it turns into something else.
A boat.
Like a yeah, like these things are vessels.
Yeah, like both of those directions, like that it's a thing that is moving, but it has like essentially not invisible, but like not immediately perceptible root anchor point, but also like that there being a method of turning it into a vessel, which might be cutting the root. Like
I think sorry, please.
No, do say. I'll say.
I insist.
Okay, because I have an interesting way of cycling this back, not to closure, but just to point out one thing. Like one of the sort of origin points for this branch was this ideas with plants, like people who like use plants to kind of divide their ideas. Like if a new leaf grows, they have to think about this. What if this whole thing was like reflection of this method that you're like utilizing different sources? Let's start with this plants and nature, and you project things which might be ideas but also processes to things, and then utilize their physical qualities to permutate the process, and that in itself would be a process.
Yeah, that speaks to the point I was about to raise in regards to, like, you know, we're also really using metaphor here as like a way to understand how we orient ourselves, what are the possible moves, and describing like the quality of that movement.
Yes.
You know?
But we're using system metaphor, which is in agreement with you. But just pointing like, in a way, like traditional metaphor, the tenor and the vehicle and whatever is like quite conventionally thought in like between words or phrases. But this is where the system itself can behave like a metaphor, like relation between one system and another is a metaphoric relation.
Yes.
Which is a huge opening.
And very beautiful.
Yes.
Just thinking about this lily pad turning into a lotus flower and then riding the flower.
Yes. And even there's like, just picking this, like actually, like now thinking of this quote unquote group or whatever it is that utilizes this kind of different projections and takes their whatever they have as abstract and projects it into different environments, elements, like lily pads, which can be real places or images or whatever. And then that in itself is a group where people go exploring, finding places to project and then bring them back. And then that as quote unquote an organization that gathers, like somebody gathers berries, this gathers structures, which then become ways of permutation and structural variation and systematic metaphor.
So then, like, what we're really also talking about is that while we are starting with the metaphor of the lily pad, what the movements that we're doing even in the conversation we're having right now, is we're leaping from metaphor to metaphor, right? And so, I mean, this is like a much more poetic form of discourse exploration. Yeah, it's just so beautiful. I really want to see this application. I really want to see this happen.
Hey,
let's do this as soon as possible. We're doing it right now.
yeah. System poetics.
I love it. Co-poetics.
Jakub, if you're jumping out, do you have any last words of system co-poetics? Yes, could definitely be added. But since I caught you just before you leave, like if you want to add something or say some words from your end, go ahead.
This was like related to the lily pads, also like still within the frame of the like of the of the plant. It's like also kind of the emerging questions like, oh, there is some limited energy for the leaves, and that they perhaps somehow compete also even when being in the same flower. So how do they decide which get pruned? How do they decide which get or receive the light? And so and this is kind of, for me, I was like relating it to the it's kind of that a lot of the ideas that are coming up in relation to metaphors or are very much for me like about exploration and generation and kind of branching and so I was thinking what might be the complement, which would be kind of the pruning and the selection and like the second part of the, like in the design, it would be the double diamond. In nature, it would be generation and selection or pruning. Like, what might be the complementary, or like the fitness, or like yes. So that was the part which was going through my mind as kind of the balancing question to the very opening up, diverging or generative aspect. So kind of the converging, selecting, pruning aspect, something like that. Yeah,
that's a good. That's a good question, and I thought of that already. Like, I mean, this doesn't have to be the answer, but think of this. Think of this whole game having another layer. Of course, it could have many other layers, but just let's deal with just one. And there is a move where you can raise anything, like frame, and raise anything that happens in the game into the other layer, which is kind of like picking up a berry and putting it in. Like, this is a good idea. Or like, this is something I want, like, it's almost like saving. Like, so in a way, like, even through and during the playing, you could also, like, from the kind of endless growth of it, constantly raise things that you want to kind of keep and give some stability to. And of course, you could then move to, like, actually kind of setting a play where you play on that other layer, and maybe your rules are, now we cannot move around, now we cannot go outside, we have to be inside here and add more details. But we can still use sort of similar methods. But now this, like, that we are now locked ourselves in here is keeping things much more limited in this, like providing stability and providing more in-depth detail to that thing. So, like I said, this is not the only way, but it was precisely a way to think about, which I think is a very good question, is like, once you have the generation, which is now very wide because it's system poetic, and for other reasons as well, you can provide, just by adding on this other layer, a way to, you know, pick from the wilderness, pick from the jungle, and then play towards stability rather than play towards diversity.
Yeah, and I think this is really, even this conversation, that it is inspiring is, I find useful because it's kind of, yeah, the persistence or stability of kind of even like the, let's say, the neural connections that get created, or the ways of not just conceptualizing but learning to operate with the world. Let's say if it was projected to kind of the organization within the materiality, or how to say it, or like in large time scales, then they had, let's say, also an interesting question for me that would be interesting to explore. Like,
Yeah.
and I guess that's it's because partially it is also like one way of selecting, which we are used to, or I might be used to, is constraining it through defining a goal or a purpose. But there are other ways, and this is nice to be also exploring here, not just saying, oh yeah, so what's the goal, what's the purpose, but what's the other ways to
Yeah, and you can
make it,
always
yeah.
you can always push a goal towards the structure. Like the hard part is actually kind of creating the way of moving between this, like rather way of connecting these things. But then on top of this, like to put a super simple structure, we could have played this with a goal, like a filter. We come through the filter that we have this goal of creating an organization, or what happens in an event next Sunday, whatever it is. And that goal has that the event next Sunday has to have like interaction between people, or whatever it has. All of that works. And you could push it on top of this play. And then it would frame itself towards that. Of course, it's not always that simple, but it's always like simpler than to frame once you have the structure that connects all of these things, that then provides a frame of like organized systematicity and stabilization. Even like with the example of a goal, like, and somebody makes a move that is outside of a goal, other players say, hey, that's not towards the goal, so that's the wrong move. And now you're creating a direction.
Yeah, and I guess this is like also what was coming up, because what was kind of fresh in my mind was the course where you visited, and when I was trying to frame it in, like, let's say, a bit playful ways. And I was thinking, yeah, that each of us, our minds can have a bit different profile of what is good at or what it's not good at. And my mind is not that good at like connecting it to the goal. That's perhaps it's getting drawn to this like sub area of thinking a bit more. And I was thinking, yeah, I could design a little bit of exercise to, for example, finding the bridges, and the kind of reality check for me would be, are the juices flowing? Like, are we keeping the motivation and engagement of myself and the students with and within, while staying with the systematics? I don't know if it's making sense, but it's me kind of, it's fleshing out possible didactics, how to relate it to some competencies that I can be using, for example, in the course, or yeah, something like that.
Yeah, like just to practicalize that, what if you made a role, like you made a goal, but then you also made a role called the goalkeeper, and you gave it the right/move of always interrupting and saying, or asking the question, is that towards the goal, or how is that towards the goal? And now you created a role that somebody can play, which then strengthens most likely the goal, presence of the goal in itself. Like, and it could be a role that somebody they play amongst others, but they have this role, or it could be somebody playing only that role. Who knows? But like, and once again, not saying that's the way, but that is definitely a way to strengthen the goal by just adding the role to it. But it's still using the same palette, and it's using just a couple of words, but it's already affecting the interaction in a very substantial way.
Yeah, which is really cool. I'm sorry, I need to jump
no,
on the call
no
with
worries.
Joel. Yeah, thank you, Beko.
But great comments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really liked what he was saying also about like the nutrients with the lily pads. Right. Then there's like the whole question about like the economic substrate of the ecology of concepts, which I think is totally crazy to
Yes.
explore.
And a good phrase, ecology of concepts.
Yeah. And then like also I was just thinking about like it's not just that we can move from like one lily pad to the ones that are next to, but like you could even potentially have like a point thing where if the bridge is like huge, right?
Yes.
Then you get more points because you've already laid it out so that relatively we perceive that that it's already challenging to do these ones that are these little jumps or something, you know? So that could be interesting as well.
Yeah, and it's also like, once again, like, and this is a positive trait, you're using game design like approaches. Like, okay, what if we add like a long bridge? And then you also mentioned points. And like you're using this because they are available, which is really cool because that's a very wide palette. Like, because then I could now say, okay, what the point stands for are seeds, which allow you to plant a new lily pad. And now the game changes again. I'm not saying that's the right way to approach points, but like we can be in this conversation in this design space.
Some paths might be ephemeral, right? And yeah, I don't know, but I think the question of like the offer is super key here.
Yes.
Because it's like, if I'm going to offer a position, I'm going to offer the position, which is like through the offers, we can create the terrain. We're offering the reposition.
Yes.
Offering that a bridge is valid. Like that is a good conceptual jump. Like I'll accept that bridge to come into reality. So we can make a terrain like pretty, at least just with that, and like, yeah, we can create like a cooperative landscape.
Yeah, the offer is key because I mean it can do other things, but it opens a couple of possibilities. First of all, of course, it can be useful that we pre-design the game and how the lily pads work and so on. Like, and that in itself is useful. That leads to detail that is. But if it's just that, then it's always kind of played the same way, unless we step into completely meta and change it. But the offer as a move could, inside the game, offer a change, for example, which then would allow others to either accept it or not. And you could have any interactions there, like some jump into it and they start to play a different game. It's a majority or whatever, and then that decides whether we jump into that or not. And that, of course, allows for modifications, but also additions, because it creates this relation that like it expresses the dynamic or the potential rather than the actual. Like it allows for this social relation that is not enforced, but rather committal. So it does other things, but that is a key possibility for an offer move, is like any space can retain the potential that hasn't even been understood yet. But because of the offer, there is a socially functional way of defining and including that potential into the play.
This is great.
Yes, and I think like from here, there is a framing that you can kind of make this into a weird game, like to offer to people that is kind of like an RPG, but not, because it's way more expanded. Like, because like at any point it could project to real world, etc. Or it could start in a real space, but it can be put in a frame that people can understand potentially how to play it, and then how that play is generated in itself, which is rather interesting in itself. Like I don't know what exactly should be the framing. Hey, Luis, sorry, like you came later and didn't give you the time to say hello. So if you want to say last words before you leave, unless.
I think it's gone. It's gone.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Wait, was that Luis Fernando?
yes.
Oh, dope. Cool. Yeah, I invited him to the thingy. That's cool.
Yeah, like the management when there's more people gets hard, and often when people send their messages, it's too late and they're out because like I should have given him the space to introduce himself, but it happened. Yeah, like I mean, like inside of that framing, it could be detailed in many ways, but there is clearly like a simple playable form that can contain this range of potential that can be formulated from here.
This seems relatively easy to implement as well. Like,
Yeah.
in its basic form, at least, like should be pretty easy to implement and could be really fun, like for our organization.
Yes. And it's also a form that an existing organization can dive into this mode to create fiction for itself and then jump into fiction to make it real. So it can be also a way of becoming pliable, flexible from a form that is normally considered static.
It's like making mind mapping, like for organizational possibility.
Yeah,
Just
into the physical world,
playful.
which starts to behave like mind mapping, but includes figurality and system poetics.
Yeah. It's really like a poetic unfolding of like the discourse landscape thing. Yeah, fuck. That's pretty crazy.
That's good thoughts towards closure. I think this is maybe, I don't know how you feel all left. Jakub keeps on jumping in and back and forth, but that's interesting. So any thoughts of closure? I was thinking like that this is a good moment to digest. Like, okay, these possibilities, let's digest. But what are your thoughts? Any comments, whatever?
I would like to flesh out this lily pad game a bit more.
Sure.
That would be nice. Yeah. And maybe play it a bit more.
Same.
Yes.
And it would be useful to even have the, I mean, at least to me, useful to have the form of it as well, like keep it lily padding without abstracting it too much, but really start from lily pads and see where it goes. I think it could be really fun.
Yeah. We can
Like,
even
that's like a mural board in itself, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally. That's what I was gonna say.
Labels
we can use one of these jam boards or a Miro board and then like prompt maybe a pond and then prompt different lily pads that we can put on top and really like play with different
for ourselves, and we move them across like the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk, and move our pieces as we go.
That would be amazing.
And one can use that image. I mean, the image is also available in the Telegram post for this event because it was one of them. So like if you take that and save that, you get the image. There might be a larger one. I can try to find it, but it's fairly large already. So, but this of course opens up the possibility that you bring other images of lily pads. You don't have to stay here, which is a completely valid way to play. Like just to open that up.
Yeah, I'm thinking that maybe like so in the way that we've got like the foreground and we've got the background of this image, we could have like we could just maybe start with just the circles or something, with like the labels of like the concept, and we just figure out like how do we want to organize them, and as we move, we can maybe add more texture, maybe before or after, I don't know. To the background, or to replace the circle or something with like an actual object, whether it be a lily pad or a flower or a boat or whatever, you know? But that way we can transform both the background as well as the object which we're using to traverse the terrain.
And there is a cool possibility, not that one has to use it, but one could think of, you know, Photoshop almost like a game design tool. Like you take this picture or any other picture of lily pads, and then, like Leo said, if one wants to start from just the pads, you filter everything else out. Or you make some other filter, and now your game board has changed because system poetics. The system changes because the image changes. So just to open this possibility that in a way, in this sense, because you can change the image by Photoshop, Photoshop becomes kind of game organizational design tool. Like this image filtered out is a different way, context of play, scene of play than the image in itself.
And I was just jumping into before Joel can jump on for a few finishing words. Perhaps I can blur those out still too.
Yes, yeah, we're generally in finishing words,
Yeah.
but now you at least hear them as well. Like,
Yeah.
but I think
could...
do say.
Yeah, it's just also just a few finishing words if there's still space for those.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think I missed a few sentences, but I think I caught the drift. Yeah, because just jumping off it kind of. So yeah, it's per all those ideas, and just wanted to share that. I think perhaps for when you were saying what could be doing the next time. So what really resonated was the ideas around how I don't know how Leo you said it, but it was kind of the economics of the conceptual ecology, or like
ecology of concepts.
Yeah, ecology of concept, or like the economy underlying the metaphor. Yeah,
because I
reference to what you were talking about with like the nutrients in the lily pads, and so the ecology supporting the.
Yeah, because it kind of connected back to when Pekko you were saying that used the metaphor of keeping this bubble alive, like in terms of kind of resisting the standard patterns of organizing or like thinking organizations, that this needs to be kept alive. So this is just connected. It's like, oh, so what is the energy that is needed to sustain certain concepts, and what's the kind of circulation and how they get nutrients and like because it can be right, and then it turned out like that actually sometimes it can really serve as a way to reach a more, let's say, I will blurb out the term like cognitive efficiency, or like the bioenergy of organizing our thinking, and kind of a scaffolding to perhaps overcome some limitations. Like, for example, if I tend to be a bit ADHD, when tired, this can serve as a way how to be energetically more efficient or something like that. But anyway, so those were some reflections.
No, but that's a very good point, because like, as you kind of phrased it, what like the example of that, you could take an organization that considers itself static, like we are this. Or maybe they have some way of changing, but that's kind of like set Lego blocks, like we can make proposals here. But this is a way to like that they could buy this kind of not just fiction, but really system poetics. They could enter into a mode of plasticity. So in a way, this is kind of like, it's ecology of concepts, but it's also like ecology of organization. That it's a way how they can move, like grow and fold and flourish like plants, like, which is kind of happening here, like in a way, like how there was first an image, there was lily pads, there were some ideas of connecting plants and ideas. Leo started drawing bridges. All of this is very much plant growth, but at any point we could solidify. Like if we arrive to the details of this is how this method works, we could solidify and say, okay, this is now how we organize ourselves. Like any point we can frame that. but in this sense, it's behaving like ecology. It's behaving like plant life of organizations. So that just underlined from.
I'm thinking that as long as we're doing ecology, we can even go beyond plants and start talking about animal-like concepts, right? The creatures of the creature concepts,
Monster
the
manuals.
concepts that move like wind across the terrain, that
Yes.
there is an opportunity for a little bit, but not, you know?
Yes, monster manuals of organizations. Yes, and other
ecology.
Yeah, and this is yes, this is also something to digest, I think. I think precisely taking all of this and then chewing, and then like taking these ideas of how to develop this lily pads along the chewing. That could be a good point of closure, because a lot of doors were opened up, but also a lot of bridges were drawn how to walk through that space.
I agree, but I need to make one last point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so continuing on the ecology of concept, and then going to the point, Jakob, you were making about the nutrients. I mean, there's like a dynamic, the ecology has like this economy and a dynamic of positionality and whether something can persist over time and where, based on its dependencies and its requirements, like and the exchange of like resources, etc. And so like these are also economic spaces, right? These are also it's like when we say ecology and we say that, oh, the concept of a bird, right? Or something, or like a concept that is like a bird in that it requires these things, but it is also like something else in that it requires these other things in order to persist and to be present for us in this moment, in this space. Can I add certain nutrients to the environment and look at what creatures and what kind of concepts start to bloom, or, you know?
And yeah, what doesn't start to bloom? Like in a way, like you adding bridges were you adding ingredients and they started to bloom. But maybe something else was added and it didn't start to bloom, but this is very ecological. Like in a way, like all of this is kind of semantic ecology. Like semantic in the widest sense of really it's about what grows as meaning, and not just as meaning, but also a pattern of operation in itself. So yeah, highly interesting. And this also, I can say, we can think about maybe a right framing for it and time framing, space framing, but this opens a secret bonus level, because I, like before EXA, in my last art years, I worked for 2 years on kind of ecology of concepts, not with that title. It was more finding like different, like how to make parallels to concepts that behave like creatures, behave like places, and where that might be very useful material here. But maybe let's leave that for later, because I think in some ways this is more systematic. Like I think this is certainly a kind of evolution that has elements that is beyond what that was, but there were some interesting forms in that. Is like for example, how you can have like concept like thing, but it's more like a creature, and therefore you're expected to have it living or moving on its own rather than being like a static description. Anyway, that's a secret bonus level for other time and other session, which might be useful ingredients for this ecology that we're building.
I am I think this concept is taking a hold of my body because I have another impulsion to say another thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Sellers, the guy, that dude,
Yeah.
yeah, he had this concept of the manifest versus the scientific image of whatever. And so like it's the difference between like, yeah, scientific view of the world or like cultural whatever, right? And we have this image of how the system functions or our current concept of humanity. That stuff is more on the manifest side, and then the scientific side is different. And there's a gap between the two. And so what I'm thinking is like, I mean, what we're describing with ecology of concepts, with nutrients, with these kinds of things, very literally could be used to do actual ecological mapping and align. One of the biggest goals of Sellers' philosophy was to try to align the scientific and the manifest image, because when they got too separated or far apart, it would result in crises at the level of because our idea and our imagination does not align with scientific possibility, right? So you know, and so that's for him, like, that's the fundamental cause of crisis. And so I'm thinking like, while this allows us to express the more manifest side of like poetic imagination, in that it also allows us to express the scientific side and to what extent we want and to experiment with like how those connections function. We could literally start thinking about things like what does a poetry of chemistry look like? What is the poetry of adding oh, I'm going to add more nitrate or like nitrogen to the soil or something. I don't know. I used to study soil, but not anymore. And yeah, like what does that do? How does that change my conceptual landscape in terms of like the bridges or paths that, you know, I don't know, like it's really like playing between science and also the manifest image, right?
Yeah. And so-called physical reality, like, and every kind of, not just the form as a surface, but also the systems that it offers, like bridge to communicate and interoperate with like, yeah, that's a lot to digest. We can leave it there, and maybe a final underlining. We had very little moves and actually very little starting game concepts, game mechanics for all of this. Like we had a couple of moves, and then we had like roles and moves and scenes. And I just want to underline it because it doesn't take much. It just takes like these elements that support the approach. It doesn't have to be complicated, and it can also be very vibrant. Like it can loan from this sort of role-playing games this sort of vibrancy of like fiction in a way, like, and then solidify from there and move back to this sort of vibrancy of possibilities. So yeah, that's my thoughts of closure towards digestion.
Yes, let us digest.
And let us use that way to stop the recording. Welcome to the state of digestion.